What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Cinema Corner. My name's Josh, and today I'm going to be reviewing Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, which hits Netflix, I believe, next weekend, but it is getting a limited theatrical run for the next couple of weeks. There have been over 60 feature film adaptations of Mary Shelley's original novel, which I think has become a bit of a timeless classic and has inspired so many similar stories. It is so influential in pop culture and probably always will be. I remember reading it back in high school, but I did need to brush up on the material in preparation for Del Toro's version. Ironically, I think the only other adaptation that I've seen is the 1931 black and white film. And supposedly, Frankenstein is kind of a dream project for Del Toro. He's wanted to make this his entire career. He's very passionate about pretty much every movie that he makes, so I have to take that with a grain of salt. But apparently this one was pretty special for him. When it comes to Del Toro, I think Pan's Labyrinth is his masterpiece 100%. That is the only film in his filmography that I think fully lived up to the hype. I'm a bit hit or miss on some of his other movies. I don't think there's anything that stands out to me as bad. I just don't think that I'm as positive on a lot of them as other people are, and I tend to be more mixed to lukewarm positive. So I guess if you're a major Del Toro fan, you should take this review with a grain of salt. Regardless of what you think about the quality of his work, I think we can all agree that he is most certainly a purveyor of dark fairy tales about misunderstood monsters who are actually just tortured souls and have a lot more going on under the surface. Visually, I think this is a very Del Toro movie, but in material, it is actually quite faithful to the source material. I think almost everyone knows the basic story, but just in case, here's a quick synopsis. Brilliant scientist Victor Frankenstein, in his quest to conquer death, brings a monstrous creature to life from the dead, literally from body parts assembled from various corpses, and this creature might just lead to the undoing of both of them. I say that this is structurally faithful to Shelley's novel because it plays out in the same format. The opening scene is actually basically the concluding segment of the story. We're introduced to Victor when he's on the hunt for the creature that he created. He runs into this expedition ship that is trying to go to the North Pole, but they are stranded in a bunch of ice caps. He encounters the crew and basically tells them his entire story and how he got to this point. And then we get these two chapters, one from Victor's perspective, and then the second one follows his creature. And I must say, Del Toro's sympathy for the creature, who is portrayed here by Jacob Elordi, is quite inflated. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think he sacrifices a bit of the nuance by painting Victor as a completely egotistical douchebag for the sake of conveniently making the creature appear more sympathetic. Granted, he's always had an affection for the unfairly demonized. I mean, take a look at Hellboy or The Shape of Water. But again, what gets lost in translation, I think, especially when you look at Shelley's novel, is the nuance. In the book, we as readers are left to conclude who the real monster is. The lines are blurred. Both Victor and the creature do bad things, but both are also humanized, and I think that's an important distinction to make. And both of these characters should be fascinating, right? I mean, we have Victor, who essentially has delusions of godhood and extreme hubris. Early on, we get a flashback to his childhood in which his father, played by Charles Dance, basically gives us a biology lesson as he tries to explain to his son that he'll never be as good as him. But unfortunately, I feel like that's the most depth that we get from Victor and the most insight into why he behaves the way that he does and why he is motivated to carry out this experiment. As soon as he brings his experiment to life, he becomes cartoonishly evil. And being that we get an entire segment of the film devoted to him, I wanted to see more reflection on the consequences of his creation, and we only really get that at the very end. Don't get me wrong, Oscar Isaac is great. I don't think it's the performance that is failing the film here, but it's just the one-dimensional way in which the character is written. I do think he becomes quite cartoonish at times, and it contrasts deeply with the melancholic, tragic tone that Del Toro is going for, especially when it comes to the second segment of the film, which follows the creature, and that is much more serious and dark, depressing. The transition between these segments would feel a lot more natural if Victor was as complex as his creation. Somehow I've made it this far into the review without even mentioning my distaste for Netflix. I simply struggle lately to support their product line of just absolute slop. And I think a lot of people will see Netflix original slapped on the poster for this movie and instantly think the worst. And I do think this is one of the few that will slip through the cracks because it does feel like the complete vision of one filmmaker. And Del Toro's movies are always visually interesting to me, even if it doesn't all work. The Crimson Peak fans have definitely won because this has loads of gothic atmosphere with the castles and the rundown 19th century Victorian style villages, but also the futurism mixed with that sort of steampunk style. But what makes Del Toro's eye unique to me is his use of color. Whereas most directors would go for a much more monochromatic look to achieve the gothic atmosphere that Del Toro is going for here, he makes it very bright and lively. Sometimes it does go a little too far though, and I think there are moments that almost feel like visual overload. There's a segment in which Victor experiences these dreams and he believes that he's communing with this angel, and it's just so bright and in your face and crazy with the visual effects, and I think it was a bit much. Moving back into the performances and touching on what is perhaps the strongest element in the entire film for me is Jacob Elordi as the creature. And to be honest, I wasn't expecting this. It's not that I have anything against Jacob Elordi or even that I think he's a bad actor. I just had no idea that he would bring such depth to this character. And he really does a good job of putting the audience in the shoes of his character and making you feel that loneliness, that temptation towards rage, and yet he still feels a sense of innocence. One segment, which might be my favorite in the entire film, follows the creature as he wanders off into the woods and stumbles across this family and sort of does these little nice deeds for them without presenting himself so they don't know who he is. And he forms a relationship with this blind man. And it was one of the more kind of pure moments in the movie that you really got to understand who he is under the surface. And the problem is this movie is called Frankenstein, not Frankenstein's monster. And somehow I feel like Victor was so shortchanged. I just wish that these two characters got an equal amount of attention. It's also worth noting that this movie is on the longer side at 2.5 hours, and it has a fairly simple narrative structure. Unfortunately, that means that there is a lot of narrative fluff, and I think the film would have been much better off spending this extra time getting us more emotionally invested in the characters and more invested in the central premise. I wanted to be thinking about the themes more, who is the real monster? And will these characters come to terms with their monstrous tendencies? Instead, the movie offers up a line of dialogue which basically answers that question for us. Somebody literally says, "You are the monster," to another character. I could not believe that Del Toro put something so on the nose and blatantly superficial into his script. There are some other random things that happen that just pulled me out of the experience. At one point, it randomly turns into an action movie with CGI wolves. That didn't work. Mia Goth and Christoph Waltz are both in this. I haven't even mentioned them yet. Their performances were good, but I was not a fan of the way their characters were utilized. It feels like they were simply plot devices to conveniently motivate other characters to do certain things. And I know that's how all characters work in a lot of stories, but it just felt like they served no other purpose. And they're such talented actors, I wanted to see more of them in here. And without delving into spoilers, one of the big changes from the novel is the way these two characters play into the story and the conflict that arises between Victor and his creature later down the line. I feel like I've been talking a little bit more negatively about this film than I intended to. I think Del Toro's Frankenstein is a solid, if heavily flawed adaptation that does a lot of things right. There are a lot of standout sequences in here, and the most unfortunate thing is that with a few moderate changes, I could see this being a masterpiece. But the way certain characters are utilized, the fact that Victor is nowhere near as interesting or nuanced as the creature that he makes in this movie, it just kind of feels like it fails the audience by not going that extra mile to really make this the best version of itself that it can be. I'm going to give Frankenstein 3.5 stars. Even though it does fall short of greatness, I still think it's a good film. If anything, I suppose it's on me for expecting it to be a hyper-faithful adaptation, especially when it starts out so structurally faithful and then eventually becomes, well, a very Guillermo del Toro movie. At the very least, I think we could have some fascinating conversations down in the comments about the things that Del Toro changed from the source material. Which things do you think paid off? Which ones didn't? What do you want to see in your version of a definitive adaptation of Frankenstein to the big screen? If you're going to check this one out, try to catch it while it's in theaters, because I just hate the prospect of recommending that you check something out on Netflix, because I'm losing faith in that platform by the day. But guys, this is where I'm going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more content like this. I'll catch you all in the next review. See you later.